Studies lecture by Dr. Mojares, revisiting Rizal and reading Pigafetta. This is one of the public programs that we have for the exhibition and spectral comparisons, to which we'd like you to go around and see after the talk. We would like to introduce first Dr. Mojares. Trained in literature and anthropology, Dr. Mojares won several national book awards from the Manila Critics Circle for works in the fields of literary criticism, urban and rural history, and political biography. He has been a recipient of prizes for his short stories, a national fellowship in the essay from the UP Institute of Creative Writing, and teaching and research fellowships from the Ford, Toyota, and Rockefeller Foundation, Fulbright Program, and Social Science Research Council. He served as visiting professor at the University of Wisconsin, University of Hawaii, and University of Michigan. Dr. Mojares is Professor Emeritus at the University of San Carlos, Cebu City, and was the founding director of its Cebuano Study Center. He was honored with the Gawad Balagtas Award for Appeal in 1997 for his contributions to the development of Philippine literature and is national artist for with that, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mojares.
Last year. And thank you for being here. Glad to see old friends in the audience. I think I need to explain, if only to myself, why I am here. I was kind of trying to had my problems with like what exactly I'm going to talk about up until the last few days. Anyway, I was invited to speak on an article of mine that was used in the exhibition catalog of the Philippine Pavilion at the 2017 Venice Biennale. And so when I was asked for permission to use the article, kind of I didn't have a clear sense of what it was all about, but kind of, to get your article kind of reprinted, kind of is a gratifying thing. So I said kind of yes right away. And this article entitled Rizal Reading Pigafetta originally appeared in my book, Waiting for Mariang Makiling, which was published in 2002. So 15 years before it was reprinted for the Venice exhibition. Hence, it is only tangentially related to the exhibition. And so for this reason, I have to think about what I can say now that would be relevant to today's occasion. Because the principal event really is the exhibition. So this would be kind of corollary side event to the exhibition. So I had problems relating myself to the exhibition itself because to begin with, visual arts is not my field at all, and probably would have very little, if at all, to say about the exhibition itself, which I saw for the first time when I came over. So I cannot speak directly about the exhibition since, as I said, the visual arts is not my field, but perhaps I can say something of interest on the theme of the exhibition in relation to the essay I wrote over 15 years ago. So it's rather a kind of a circuitous thing, kind of getting connect, to connect myself to this particular event, and I can't kind of present the essay itself. I have to kind of give it a new spin, as it were. The organizing theme of the Philippine exhibition in Venice, Spectre of Comparisons, I think is something that you already know, comes from Rizal's Noli Me Tangere, in a scene where Crisostomo Ibarra, newly returned to Manila of the 1880s, after a long sojourn abroad, looks out his carriage window and sees Manila's botanical garden, visited by El Demonio de las Comparaciones, Rizal's words, or the devil of comparisons. Ibarra thinks of the rich and well-tended public gardens in Europe and its better endowed colonies, beside which pales in comparison Manila's garden and kind of much else in the Spanish colony. The scholar Benedict Anderson seized on the phrase Demonio de las Comparaciones, translating demonio as specter, kind of much more attractive more attractive title. As a memorable phrase for the act of comparison that Anderson says is originary in the birth or the rise of nationalism. He writes that Ibarra, seeing Manila's botanical garden, finds himself at the end of an inverted telescope. And I quote, he can no longer matter-of-factly experience them in the gardens, but sees them simultaneously close up and from afar. It is a kind of haunting, a new, restless, double consciousness which made it impossible ever after to experience Berlin or some other kind of European city without at once thinking of Manila, or Manila without thinking of Berlin. So Anderson writes, and I quote, here indeed is the origin of nationalism, which lives by making comparisons. Though I had read portions of Anderson's Spectre of Comparisons, the book is a collection of essays. No? And I had read some of the essays at that time. I was finishing my own essay on Rizal reading Pigafetta. I probably missed out on the Spectre thing, you know. Although much of what I wanted to say in my essay had to do with what Anderson calls double consciousness and the making of comparisons in the birth of nationalism. I had used in my own essay a different epiphanic moment. Instead of the fictional Ibarra seeing the botanical garden in Manila, Rizal at the other end of the world discovering Pigafetta's chronicle of the Magellan voyage in London's British Museum in 1888. It was a eureka moment for Rizal, writing from London to Marcelo del Pilar in 1889. Rizal excitedly wrote that he had found Pigafetta's account of the Philippine discovery of 1521. Lamenting that he did not have the time to translate the Italian text because of his work, Rizal urged del Pilar to get one of the Filipinos in Madrid to study Italian and translate translate Pigafetta to Spanish or Tagalog, so that, and I quote, so that it may be known how we were in 1521. So he's excited in coming across this important text which provided a glimpse into what Filipinos or what the Philippines was like in 1521. And of course, Rizal, with kind of his natural gift for languages, said, you know, Italian you can learn in just a month. So he was kind of trying to interest somebody to translate it to Spanish or Tagalog so it will be known to Filipino readers. Rizal was in London in the course of his second European sojourn after he was practically forced to flee the Philippines because of the hostile reception to Noli Me Tangere from the colonial authorities. In London, Rizal had decided to devote himself to writing a history of the Philippines by working on an annotated edition of Antonio de Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. It can be said that Rizal's studies at this time was a project in comparison. After all, comparativism was the dominant approach in 19th century science for knowing cultures, races, and the natural world. Driven by how colonialism had represented Filipinos as a lesser race, a people without a culture and history, Rizal embarked on disproving all these by invoking European scholarship itself to argue that Filipinos constitute a distinct, integral nation among nations in the world. In Rizal's case, therefore, the experience of double vision of seeing the Philippines in Europe and vice versa mainly took the form of reading and research. This was what kind of intensely occupied him at this time. In today's lecture, I shall not dwell on Rizal's extensive reading, since this is mainly what my essay, Rizal reading Pigafetta, was about. I shall instead explore the subject of Filipino travel in the 19th century. I choose to dwell on travel because it is a familiar experience to all of us, and one that invariably induces the making of comparisons, usually between one's home and the places one visits. And I would like to think, this kind of probably a bit stretching the point here, that it is a subject relevant to the themes of cross-cultural encounters and diasporic identities highlighted in the present exhibition. The classic encounter of the new and the old world is one usually characterized in terms of the shock of otherness, strangeness, fear, fantasy, and wonder, the time of the age of discovery. In the literature of this encounter, the native is the discovered rather than the discoverer. Even with the rise of travel in the age of empire, in kind of like the 19th century, the relationship remained unequal. We were the discovered rather than the discoverer. Edward Said noted how at this time there was a great imbalance in the flow of Westerners going eastwards as compared to Easterners going west, as well as radical disparities in the reason, purpose, and effects of these movements. While Westerners traveled to Europe, while Westerners traveled to the Orient to conquer and occupy, administer colonies, extract wealth, gaze at their possessions, or create fantasies of the other, and in these fantasies themselves. The Eastern travelers in the West were there, Said says, to learn from and to get at an advanced culture. The fact is, the reality is much more complex. I think what is quite remarkable about Rizal, a 19th century Filipinos of his class, was the ease and confidence with which they traveled in Europe. Kind of a sense of the time of it. It's almost like they are inheritors of this world. They're not kind of... This is already evident in what may be the earliest travel book written by a Filipino. Faustino Villafranca's Correspondencias de un viaje desde Filipinas a Europa, which was published in 1870. A Tagalog priest from a prosperous Manila family, Villafranca traveled through Europe for almost the entire year of 1869. He was for almost a year, he was traveling across Europe. A well-placed native priest, and he was a classmate of Father Jose Burgos at Santo Tomas. It does not appear that Villafranca was in Europe for a purpose other than leisure and self-edification. From my reading the book, it doesn't seem like there was really kind of a purpose other than actually playing tourist. And in that sense, he may very well be the first Filipino tourist, because he was there just to kind of, in a sense, see the sights and learn and enjoy. Villafranca was an enthusiastic traveler who visited some 30 towns and cities, staying longest in Italy and Spain. He was a privileged traveler. He had an audience, and he kind of had the connections. He had an audience with Pope Pius IX in Rome, and with the exiled Spanish Queen Isabel II in her residence in Paris. So he was no ordinary traveler. He showed an avid interest in observing what he called the march of human progress in the world, admiring the boulevards of Paris, London's Crystal Palace, and Underground Railway, and Europe's architectural monuments. What is striking about Correspondencias is that it shows the 36-year-old Villafranca as one sophisticated, kind of versed in Spanish and Latin, and cosmopolitan in his knowledge of European classics and history. He was curious but not particularly overawed by what he saw, and while very conservative in political matters, he was for once kind of sincere royalist. He was urbane in his observations of Western society. In essence, Villafranca's travels partook of the character of a pilgrimage, a believer's journey to the centers of spiritual and secular power, which would be cities of Rome, Paris, London, Madrid. Now, if Villafranca's journey seemed like a pilgrimage, the journey to Europe taken by another Filipino 17 years later would be radically different. This is the case of Antonio Luna, a 20-year-old student who arrived in Madrid in 1886 to continue studies he had started in Manila. In Travel Impressions he published in La Solidaridad in 1889, Luna wrote that he came to Spain imagining he would find in Madrid the magnificence of a European city, but found instead squalor and people uncouth in their manners. So he wrote, his illusions and hopes, he said, vanished before reality, noting the backwardness of the metropolis. He archly wondered, and I quote, I asked myself if I were in Morocco, in the dangerous borders of the reefs, a mountainous region in Morocco, and not living in the capital of a European nation. Luna ended by warning, he said, Filipinos who are in the Philippines, do not be carried away by the song of the siren to the immense flights of the imagination, because the disenchantment is terrible. The goal of a colonized native, because that's kind of rather striking, some young man coming from the margins of the empire to come to the very center of the empire and speak of Spain in this manner. The goal of a colonized native from the empire's margins angered Spanish readers, which is published in Madrid, in Spain. Luna's comments were attacked in the Spanish press with such virulence that Luna challenged the Spanish editor to issue a retraction or face him in a duel unto death. A duel unto death. Because the Spaniard had maligned him and the Filipinos. When the Spaniard refused to pick up the challenge, Luna tracked him down and finding him in a cafe in Barcelona's Plaza de Catalonia, called the Spaniard a coward and a dog. And Luna reported, I spat on his face and I threw my card to his face. Defending Luna, Rizal chastised, it became an issue in the Spanish press. Rizal chastised the critics for assuming that only they, Spaniards, can be truthful in their travel descriptions. Against the Spanish editor's charge that Filipinos themselves were just as ignorant of geography as the Spaniards Luna lampoon, Rizal, attacking the Spanish colonial system itself, countered by saying that Filipinos should not be blamed for it, as they are not the ones who have colleges, neither are they the teachers, nor do they make the plan of study, nor can they travel, nor make maps, and so on and so forth. For Filipinos, Rizal scathingly remarked, all the geography that is taught is reduced to the tiny piece of ground where they have to kneel down or stretch themselves to be plugged. So if you think of like kind of the Filipinos in the 19th century going to Europe, like kind of they were like, from kind of like a civilized lot who gaped at the wonders of the Europe. I mean, this example show kind of not only the exact opposite, but by the kind of the confidence of that mild word that kind of people like Luna kind of conducted themselves in Spain or in Europe. Rizal, for his part, was the ideal traveler. Barely 21 years old when he first traveled abroad, Rizal was a studious, methodical traveler, exploring foreign cities. Rather not like he explored a city and he would be carrying a bidicar. That is kind of travel book. No? That was kind of the classic travel. And he even had a pedometer. Kind of, which side is that? Kind of a device that you can measure the distances you have walked or something like that. So he was kind of very methodical traveler. He was a traveler who would have wholly endorsed what Kant, the philosopher, said, and I quote, "Knowledge of the world requires more than just seeing the world. He who wishes to draw what is useful from his travels must previously have planned his travel, not just observe the world with external senses. If we are prepared beforehand through education, then we already have a frame of knowledge that teaches us to know man. Only then are we in the position to assign each experience to its place in the whole. Through travel, one expands one's knowledge of the outer world, but this is of little use if one has not been prepared by education." So Rizal is actually a perfect example of kind of what a traveler is in this sense. If Rizal traveled with remarkable self-possession, perfectly at home in the world, it is because despite the limitations of colonial education, he was quite cosmopolitan even before he left the Philippines. One must remember Manila had the first European-style university in Asia, the Universidad de Santo Tomas. And in Rizal and his cohorts, Southeast Asia had its most westernized group of natives. In Manila, Rizal's education included a great deal of European literature, from Horace and Cicero to Chateaubriand and Dumas. In addition to the sciences, philosophy, and foreign languages, students then took up courses in Greek, Latin, and French. Rizal's family home in provincial Calamba had a library of more than 1,000 books. You know, it's pretty large, you know, for like provincial housing. Aboard a ship on his first outbound journey with passengers of many nationalities, Rizal communicated with fellow passengers in Spanish and French. And he was only in his early 20s. Equally important, Rizal's equanimity drew from the fact that throughout his travels, Rizal never lost his mooring in the home country. He was constantly making comparisons between what he saw abroad and home, bringing both the foreign and the familiar into focus. Upon first sighting the African coast in 1882, Rizal clearly had his homeland in mind when he said to himself, greeting, you know, the continent of Africa when he first saw sight of the land. Greetings in hospitable land, but famous, alas, at the cost of the blood of your sons. So kind of a fraternal greeting to the enslaved peoples of Africa. Bidding goodbye in Marseille, two Dutch girls, fellow passengers, told Rizal they were going to The Hague, but they preferred being in Batavia, their home country. Kind of going from what is now Indonesia back to the Netherlands. And Rizal replied to the Dutch girls, he said, I too love my native land, and no matter how beautiful Europe may be, I want to return to the Philippines. In his letters home, Rizal was constantly making connections. Writing to his family in Calamba about Paris, for instance, he wrote, filled with magnificent houses, the entire area of Calamba, Cabuyao, and Santa Rosa, and we'll have Paris, more or less. It was his way of making the foreign imaginable, scaling it down to the proportions of the familiar. Yet his constant tucking to and fro between the foreign and the homely also expresses the impulse to maintain perspective, to domesticate the alien and keep it at bay. Viewing an exhibition of seized military trophies from all over the world at the Museum of Artillery in Paris, Rizal wrote, it seems incredible, but the costumes and weapons of the savages of the small islands of Borneo are found there, but those of the Philippines are not even remembered. It is once again the comparative mind at work, Rizal asserting presence, lamenting his country's invisibility. Rizal's comparisons are rarely aimless. His purpose and point of reference are almost always clear. Rizal's journey as the character of a classic Malay rantau, you know, the kind of the Malay for a journey, rantau, but specifically with the meaning that of a journey to a distant land to seek a fortune, whether wealth or knowledge or skills that one brings back to one's village and kin. I mean, that's what the Malay rantau means. Which come to think of it is a type of voyage that our overseas contract workers still make today. You know, going kind of abroad in order to earn money or gain experience, and yet and yet coming back in order to with what one has earned. Neither vagabondage nor recreational tourism. It is a purposeful two-way journey. In the case of Luna and Rizal, travel and the acts of comparison that are an essential part of the experience would be important in the emergence of Philippine nationalism. Luna went to Spain to pursue higher studies, but then proceeded to subvert relations of subordination by claiming that the bright lights on the hill, the pomp and circumstance of the empire's capital, were a mirage. Rizal was awed by many of the things he saw in Europe, but refused to be seduced. He explored the world as part of his natural patrimony, and then claimed for his people their rightful place in it. They were not tourists, but travelers on a mission, seeking knowledge for a cause larger than themselves. The transnational travels of Rizal and other 19th century Filipino nationalists may be exceptional, since they do not necessarily speak of the experience of a larger number of Filipinos who traveled at the time. Seamen, particularly soldiers, and numerous nameless others not as privileged. Yet these travels are an important part of the story of Filipinos coming into a consciousness of themselves in relation to the world that constitutes the beginning of nationalism. Such foreign travels, however, are just part of the journeys that need to be taken. Rizal recognized when he last returned to the country that the journey was not at an end. In 1891, writing to the Filipinos in Barcelona on the eve of what he imagined would be his final return home, Rizal wrote in uncharacteristic Tagalog, because he kind of rarely wrote in Tagalog. He wrote mainly in Spanish, and with corresponding with people like Blumentritt, he wrote in German, and yet in this letter he wrote this particular sentence in Tagalog. He said, "Ang gamot," kind of struggling with my Cebuano. Gamot ay medicine, no? Ang gamot ay dapat ilapit sa may sakit. Ang parang napaglalabanan ay ang Pilipinas. Doon tayo dapat magtatagpo. Wow. So that was what his message to his fellow Filipinos. In bringing the medicine close to the sick, Rizal recognized that hitherto Filipino propagandists had focused their energies on speaking to the empire, addressing the empire and Europe, and that the need now was for them to speak directly to the people themselves, where the people are. It was thus that on the way home, as he was traveling home, he was already making arrangements with the help of his brother Casiano for the translation of Noli Me Tangere into Tagalog. And he had himself started to write his third novel in Tagalog. This was a needed turn, since many of the leading propagandists, despite their long-distance travels, had really such limited experience in the country itself, in their homeland. If not for his enforced exile in Dapitan, for instance, Rizal had never been further south of Manila than Calamba, than his home province of Laguna. And his personal interests did not extend too far beyond the Tagalog region. One can imagine Rizal himself speaking what Ibarra confessed in Noli, and I quote, "I was not brought up among the people, and perhaps I do not know what they did." A nation's imaginary body can be traced through people's movements in space, pointing to the journey as a meaning-creating experience. Ben Anderson cited the role of what he calls religious and secular pilgrimages in creating imagined communities. In particular, he pointed to administrative and educational pilgrimages, like government functionaries traveling from post to post, or students from various provinces converging in the educational centers. And the effects that these journeys had in conjuring the imaginary body of state and nation as fellow travelers shared aspirations and saw themselves as belonging to one community. But this was a point that actually Trinidad Pablo de Tavera made much earlier, in 1912, in an article when he cited the case of provincial merchants traveling to Manila to transact business in the capital and then associate with other merchants and come into contact with even the Governor General himself, the superiors of the religious orders, and so on. And Tavera said that when these merchants go back to their hometowns, their provinces, of course, kind of the experience of like hobnobbing with influentials in Manila, kind of in a sense, kind of empower them, and they would kind of would criticize the alcalde or the Guardia Civil and so on. And Pablo de Tavera, that in a sense this was the beginning of what would be called filibusterismo, kind of these natives kind of acting empowered because of course their wealth and in many cases their observation becoming very assertive vis-a-vis the Spaniards. So this underscores the importance of domestic travel. Kind of, because often I kind of in writing about travel, the focus is on kind of foreign travels. So the case of domestic travel is not as well studied in travel within the country. We know that demographic movements within the archipelago had accelerated dramatically in the 19th century, driven by the expansion of trade, commercial agriculture, and improvements in inter-island transportation. Circulation patterns included rural to urban and urban to rural movements within and across provinces as people flocked to towns and cities where new economic opportunities were concentrated, or moved to internal frontiers as the countryside was opened up to large-scale cash crop agriculture. In the 19th century, internal migration began to write the cultural territoriality of the Philippines. Like, take the case of Manila, for instance. A quarter of the adult population of Manila in 1893 was made up of migrants from other provinces. And this was kind of the case as well for regional port cities like Iloilo and Cebu. All this fed the creation of nation consciousness, since when people travel, ideas travel as well. Thus, as early as 1915, at the beginnings of what may we call tourism, because kind of, since tourism, as we understand it today, really started in the case of the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, or the last years of the 19th. In 1915, the writer nationalist Pigafetta de Los Santos urged promoting domestic tourism as medium for fostering among citizens the values of solidarity and tolerance. De Los Santos bemoaned that Filipinos preferred traveling abroad and thus had distorted notions of their own country, of which they know little. For De Los Santos, seeing the country, its variety and unity, differences and commonalities, was important not only for stimulating commerce, but for building self-knowledge and nation consciousness. So that's actually kind of an interesting subject to kind of study and write about the mystery of the Southern, especially like at the beginning of the 19th century, when, like for instance, the building of Rizal monuments all over the Philippines. And so you travel to all the country, you know, you're kind of, this is home, because kind of the plaza complex, they're all the same, you know, kind of it's the look of the land itself kind of conveys to you that you're home, no? Even if you're in Bicol or Ilocos or wherever. So they kind of, the landscape itself kind of conveying to us that this is home. It is remarkable how purpose-driven the journey was that Rizal took, how clear its trajectory, its point of origin, and its destination. Even if it was not always a straight line that ran from one end to the other. Displaced from home, a refugee in Europe, financially straitened, emotionally troubled, visited by dark forebodings about his future. It was not an easy journey. Yet, as an intellectual journey, his itinerary, perhaps kind of even better than an itinerarium in the medieval Latin sense of stages in the advance of knowledge. His itinerarium was clear, both for himself and the nation imagined. So I shall not speak because it is an entirely kind of different subject on kind of what has changed. Today the world is, of course, radically different. Think of the reality of failed states, virulent nationalism, war and poverty, immigration and refugee crisis, deterritorialization and homelessness. It is a world in which the journeys we take are no longer quite so simple. So one wonders if Rizal were to walk into today's exhibition, what specter of comparison would descend to hold him? Thank you for listening.
Yes, we'd like to open the floor for questions and comments.
Sir, good afternoon. Question is, which is you going to prepare the most accurate travel, Villafranca or Antonio Luna, for the description of you?
There was a kind of opposite ends of the kind of, as I said, Villafranca's travels really kind of was a kind of a pilgrimage to, in a sense, kind of the capital of his faith. He was a priest, as well as the capital of the empire, of which he was a part. And of course, at the other end, I mean, this kind of what's the word? Kind of this young Antonio Luna, completely kind of irreverent but then you have to take into account there's I think something like 17 years between one and the other. Kind of at the time of Villafranca, kind of in fact, for instance, because he was a priest, the secularization movement, the kind of agitation, even within the church itself for reforms, had not really gained ground. So, in fact, I have a question to write about how Villafranca died just a few years after he returned. It's interesting to imagine that he was not faced with the kind of choices that priests like Burgos had to face, because he lived in quieter times. So, like by the time, for instance, of the Cavite mutiny, Villafranca had already passed away. So it's interesting to imagine what he must have done or thought at the time of the Cavite mutiny. So it's so kind of but in the time of Antonio Luna, kind of the propaganda movement was already well underway. So kind of which kind of tells us how different kind of travels can be different depending on what the situation was like at your place of origin and at your. So Luna left Manila at a time when there was already a great deal of ferment going on, whereas Villafranca left Manila when it seemed like nothing was going to change insofar as the political order was concerned. So these are kind of different points in time, and which explains not entirely the difference between the two travelers, but it's kind of an important part of it.
So thank you, Rizal, for that wonderful talk. And I'm going to throw the question that you kind of opened the door to at the very end. You may or may not regret having opened the door. but I'm thinking precisely of all of there was such a hopeful aspirations implied in that there were benefits to these pilgrimages, that there would be convergence and there would be illumination and the goodness of nations, to use Kant, and Anderson absolutely was possessed by that deep belief in that.
Okay.
And how differently, so we would believe it, and the value of tolerance that would come from travel, etc. And so just the other day I was reading an interview with Putin in the Financial Times and saying it's all gone, liberalism's gone, and the kind of implied cosmopolitanism, or rather the cosmopolitanism that went with that liberalism. So I'm just wondering, it's purely speculative, but thinking about what we do going forward, how do we transform, like the message that Putin represents for all of his thuggishness and all the virulent nationalism that's closer to home. Its appeal in part is saying, well, it didn't really work because we tried tolerance, but we wound up being very afraid because we got too tolerant and too many people came in and too many of the wrong people or different people. So I just wonder, going forward, I often think we have to come to terms very squarely with the Enlightenment values and cosmopolitanism and liberalism really have run the course. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. And we do have to kind of be thinking outside the box, those of us who still are in fact committed to those things. So I'm wondering if, to ask you to push forward, I'll throw the question back to you. What would Rizal have seen in, what might the specter have been had he been in this exhibit, as well as what do you think going forward are the possibilities of not only recuperating those values, but they have to be transformed? And where do you see possible lights on the path ahead? Where do we go from here?
The point about imagining what Rizal was like, I think it completely disoriented and lost. I think they're kind of, in the sense of the idea of kind of a nation as a kind of unit remains quite powerful, and in many ways it's kind of a reality kind of by and large achieved in the Philippines. If you talk about like kind of from the time of Rizal until today, I mean, kind of existence of a nation is something that is almost like kind of given and unquestioned. Of course, you have the problem of like kind of the secession movement, and so on, but kind of and calls for that's something that has to be kind of understood and dealt with. And for instance, kind of you have all these kind of Cebu, for instance, kind of being proud as kind of a center of like autonomous sentiments, but it's a kind of I mean, like secession is even not thought, is something that is not thought and spoken about. I mean, like kind of the sense of belonging to a nation is something that's kind of is accepted. So that clearly is a gain if you think in terms of like what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the 20th century. People still felt that we need to create a sense of belonging to a nation. I think that's kind of the question, of course, as to like the matter of like then what is the substance to it, you know, in terms of like kind of participation, like economic, political, and so on in the life of the nation. So indeed, it's kind of, I think, an important challenge today is like, for instance, I think kind of something that I would not be an authority to speak about, but kind of the rise of China, the issue of sovereignty over the kind of the drift towards kind of almost like outright surrender to kind of the aggressive moves of, like what I do yesterday, like Duterte saying that like in kind of his usual rhetoric about, he was talking about missiles. That China had this kind of an arsenal of missiles, kind of they have nuclear heads. He said the only missile we have in the Philippines is the one that for quinties and firecrackers and so on, talking this kind of, like pointing that it's almost like hopeless to come to get into a confrontation with such a great powers. It's almost like almost like a case of like kind of giving way to actual kind of surrender. So kind of power relations are revised in such radical ways that it's difficult to think about exactly where all these will wind up.
I was asked by Lady Supreme Court Justice member of Japan at a dinner a very difficult question to me. He said, I said, I'm from the Philippines. And she said, okay, I'll ask you a question. Okay, go ahead. Said, when did the Philippines become the Philippines? So I had a hard time answering that. And when I came back, I asked a friend, and she said, this one, the specter of comparison. She cited this, Ryan and Anderson, Benedict Anderson's book, saying that at that point, when Ibarra saw the garden, and remember the garden in Berlin, and compared both gardens so that you could not think of Manila without thinking of Berlin, as you said, and vice versa. That was the moment when the Philippines became the Philippines. He said, why? He said, because a nation is an imagined community. And this was the start of the imagination of the Philippines as a community. So I thought that was very interesting, and since you mentioned this, and this is the exhibit, this is when the Philippines became the Philippines. What's your take on that, Professor?
Yeah, kind of the germ for like the imagining of the Philippines as a nation can be said to have started. Kind of, you have, of course, you have to like kind of the question of like actually how many share in that imagining and who. So that it's the basic idea itself is right, but the building of that imagined community probably kind of even like up until today is still going on. But because in like kind of you can also say like when did the Philippines become like fully a nation? Probably you can point to a number of markers. Like for instance, you can say the revolution, and particularly 1898, because that's what in 1896 you can still think of the revolution as something that was confined to a particular region in the Philippines, and the rest of the country really but by 1898, almost like the entire country had joined the revolution. So, and of course, it's in on that level that the creation of a country becomes quite real. You know, it's not just like people like Rizal and so on imagining a nation as something that exists, but it's something. But you need to have like an entire community imagining the nation in the same way. That's why I ended my presentation with the reference to domestic travel, because in the end, it's not just like thinking of ourselves in relation to other countries, which would be like what Rizal was primarily engaged in, right? But thinking of ourselves in relation to each other, you know. So that's in a sense the important part of the whole story. So when did we begin to kind of imagine ourselves as one community? I suppose if one has to think of one specific event, I would say the Philippine Revolution, more than anything else, was what ushered the nation into existence. So, because prior to that time, it's either in the case of Rizal, it was largely theoretical. The idea was there, but the matter of translating that into reality is a much more complex and long drawn out process. So,
good afternoon po. I'm Vincent Bernabe from the Ateneo Manila, and I'm a history student there. So my question is, how does modern scholarship see Rizal's annotations on the successors, since despite its flaws and Rizal's flaws on reconstructing the pre-Spanish history of the Philippines? So what's your take there as a historian?
despite those flaws,
The flaws of Rizal's annotations.
the flaws of Rizal.
What's your take there as an historian?
So Rizal wanted to write a history of the Philippines, I think in his methodical way, I think it was Rizal himself who said that he had finished Noli that dealt with the Philippines at present, kind of showed what the Philippines was like in the present. And so he needed to embark on the history project in order to show what the Philippines was like in the past. And el filibusterismo was supposed to be something that looked towards the future. So in this plan, he wanted to write the history of the Philippines. But he simply did not have the time, the resources, under a great deal of stress. So he settled for the next best thing. He decided something that was quickly doable, and that was to take an existing history on the Philippines and then annotate it. And so that's what he did. So he chose Florida because he felt that it was a history of the Philippines that was in the relation to mostly friar chronicles and so on. It was written by a civil official, and so not as vertically biased as many of the other histories that exist. And so that's what he did. And I found it, even the act itself of annotating it was really a radical and kind of revolutionary idea. And I don't know, like, it would be good to look at what other examples there are in other parts of the world of a colonized native annotating the official history. I mean, isn't that kind of really bold and subversive for one to take, in a sense, the colonizer history of the country and to annotate it critically? So it's like kind of a native like commenting on the colonizer's view of the country. So even the act itself of annotating it was truly significant. And in the case of like, of course, it's kind of polemical and based on clearly polemical, and it has, as you mentioned, it's flaws, it's limited. Given the conditions under which Rizal wrote. I mean, Rizal, after all, was not on a sabbatical with a big pyramid. I mean, he was not he was working on this on his own while he was in London and so there are a lot of things there that one can criticize and question with respect to kind of the scholarship involved. But I think it's the act itself of the annotation which I find the most important thing about that particular project. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Irish Cariaga from UP Diliman. And my question is, considering the current economic situation, do you think that education and like travel, considering that it's not accessible to the masses, do you think that it's possible to achieve a unified nation or to achieve an idea of an imagined community and a sense of nationalism, given that history and education, such as the one Rizal was exposed to, is not accessible to the masses, even with the free education bill and such?
I don't have a quick answer to but you have like a familiar complaint about the young people are really not interested in history and something like that. And yet you come across a lot of instances, that kind of show the opposite. It's something I've not really looked at, but I tend to believe that there's a great deal of interest and kind of appetite among young people in subjects like history. So, but the thing is, kind of the field of education has also become so complex, right, with digital media and so on. So the great benefits that come from it, as well as the great perils with respect to. But I kind of personally think and to be quite hopeful with respect to kind of young people.
I was just very struck for, thank you so much for raising us. So I was very struck with this particular term that you used, domesticating the alien. And in the same sense, actually, you can think of it, you can sort of parse it, the idea of taking the other. But the slippage between the idea of domesticating the alien, which is what was being done during the 19th century, and in sort of like you could think of it as a binary when when there was colonialism was doing the killing of the other. But actually, the slippage is very, very nuanced. And I just wanted to ask, nowadays, the fact that she says that it's very difficult to travel. I think for a lot of us, it's possible. There's the ESO seat from Pacific. But I think the fluidity by which the exchange happens, you think this sort of binary still exists, or is this we're able to be a bit more, I don't know, hopefully as critical as Rizal, or maybe we've lost that sense of criticality because of the nuances sort of been lost in the facility by which we are able to travel now, and the fluidity of cultures from one to the other, etc. And I'm not just talking about foreign travel, but also local.
So I discussed the last point. Okay.
So I was just wondering if you think it's still possible to have that sort of criticality that Rizal had traveling outside maybe for the first time or whatever. At present, contemporary times, if we're able to be as critical, or perhaps the nuance has been lost, or we just it's just too fluid.
So as I said, like think in terms of the making of comparisons, and there's something a certain stability to the narrative of Rizal, right? In the sense that the imperative there was to argue that Filipinos constitute kind of a distinct, integral kind of nation, right? And so his basic arguments about how we have a long history, a noble past, connecting the Philippines to the history of the Malay civilization, and so on. So we are people with high culture, with a long history, and so the basic arguments for demonstrating that Filipinos kind of have, as it were, the elements that constitute kind of a nation. Right? So, and then the comparisons that take place would be the comparison between, like, for Filipino culture with the cultures of other parts of the world. The comparisons are kind of in a sense, creating that a nation does exist. Kind of the comparisons are kind of clearly drawn. What the pairs are to be compared, what the terms of comparison are, and so on. But that's no longer the case today, right? In a sense, like, creating a nation is probably the easier part than making it work and sustaining it, I mean, you can kind of bring a nation into existence, but then what then? So that's kind of the greater challenge, which kind of, in a sense, kind of Rizal did not have to confront, right? So today, for instance, if you think of like the specter of comparisons, and we're talking about the birth of nationalism, but if you are kind of speaking about the specter of comparison today, the kind of what would it be like? I mean, what do you compare with what? And what would be the ground and terms for making such comparisons? So it kind of act of comparison, the act of comparison in our time is much more kind of complex, and the terms are less well defined as this was for Rizal and his generation. So that like when Ben Anderson used kind of the specter of comparison, in fact I hesitate to use the word specter and what it connotes for the case of Rizal. It's a kind of more or less kind of a very contemporary kind of, I think he used, actually there is a translation of Rizal, who did the translation for Penguin?
Harold.
Kind of, and then looked up as to how he translates demonio. And he uses kind of devilry, the devilry of comparison. So the translations differ. The kind of devilry has a much more kind of playful sound to it, like it's a little devil, something kind of. Well, it's kind of specter, of course, is a much more attractive term, kind of quite evocative. But the sense of what is spectral and ghostly may not be quite appropriate in describing what the experience and the acts of comparison were in Rizal's time. But I think it's very fitting for the acts of comparison that we make today. So as I kind of mentioned, in the case of Rizal, kind of the trajectory that the Rizal takes seems quite kind of clear and so on. But I mean that kind of a journey is kind of probably is not kind of. I mean, it's kind of going to be very difficult to replicate that in our own time.
I'm Joey Lopez from the UPT Liman, also a sympathizer. This is my radical question. If Rizal were alive today, what would be his stance with the stance of Rizal with the Duterte administration? Is this the kind of imagined nation he wanted to be?
I mean, that's difficult to imagine. I mean, that kind of question is kind of about like what would Rizal have done like if he were taking that kind of I don't really know. Kind of after all, like kind of you have to think also of like even Rizal. How old was Rizal when he died?
35. 35.
30?
5.
35?
Yes.
I mean, imagine 35 years old. I mean, what would Rizal have been like had he lived to be 60 or 70 or 80? I mean, he died quite young, right? I mean, so, which meant that, like for instance, when he, in his last days, he was on his way to Cuba in order to volunteer there and so on. So exactly what that meant and kind of and so on is not clear. So kind of probably it was kind of another kind of journey out of the country and then another return. Like when the revolution broke out in 1896, Rizal was in a ship, is that right?
Yeah.
Anchored in Manila Bay. And because I think they were kind of, it's interesting to think of like, given like what he knew of what was going on, like kind of, my sense is that it was kind of in a hub as to what was happening. So it's not clear as to given kind of his ambivalence also with respect to the revolution. So, so in many ways, it's not as though you have a person who's kind of already fully developed and finished in his so that kind of would be purely speculative to think about what Rizal would have done.
My question is, as we are trying to discuss the issue of decolonization during the era of Rizal, even today. Yeah. But here comes a new initiative, global initiative, trying to revert that decolonization, a new way of colonization again, which is in the form of climate change topic. What is your stance for this? Thank you.
You're talking about a kind of, I suppose, a kind of an ongoing process that you probably will get to a point where you can say it's done and finished. The questions of nation formation, decolonization, and so it's the main kind of challenges today. You know? I suppose one will have at the very start think in terms of what specific aspects we need to confront, establishing ranking out the problem with these parts, confronting what challenges are the most urgent. So I mean, it's difficult to think in terms of such large issues as globalization, decolonization, so climate change is a good one to start with, but I don't want to get started on that.
On behalf of the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design, we'd like to thank Dr. Mojares first off, and we'd also like to thank you for coming. We'd like to invite you to the next stop on July 17th, where we will have the curators of the Philippine pavilions for the Venice Art Biennale and Architecture Biennale. We'd also like to invite you to see the exhibition, if you have done so yet. Thank you.